Can we talk about spring break activities? Most people, party or play video games or sleep or whatever. Holmes brought home an infant to dissect, so that's a thing, I guess. Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. So I obviously love history, but another thing I love is serial killers. Ever since I was little, I was fascinated by them. I think I probably watched Silence of the Lambs 100 times when I was a kid. Seriously, I was obsessed. I mean, there's something so inherently interesting about people whose brains function differently, right? And don't judge me here. There is a reason that people are obsessed with true crime. I know I'm not the only one. Man, I wish we had true crime back then like we do now. Instead, I used to read stories online about the worst ones, the famous ones, like Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. Eileen Wuornos is really cool, Richard Ramirez, Zodiac Killer, BTK, Albert Fish, and if you hadn't heard of that last one yet, he's a real doozy. Does anyone else out there remember Crime Library? It was crimelibrary.com. It was an online repository of articles and stories about all kinds of criminals, but I only read the ones about serial killers. It's gone now, you can't find it if you look it up, but you can use the Internet Wayback Machine to check it out if you really want to. I used to love staying up and reading all those super gruesome stories, and that explains a lot, actually. Huh. But anyway, what's cool about this podcast is that I can tell stories that are historic in nature and talk about serial killers if I want to. There's an intersection there between history and crime that I think really speaks to people. So for this week's episode and the next episode, I'm going to take a look at two super famous historic killers that operated in the same period of time, but across the ocean from one another. This week, as you already know from the title of the episode, is about HH Holmes, America's so-called first serial killer, and his Chicago murder castle. Next time, we'll take a look at Jack the Ripper, who terrorized the Whitechapel neighborhood of London. Together, the two of these men represented the darker side of the gritty, industrial, fast-growing cities they operated in. But another really interesting thing to the Holmes story in particular is how it exists in our folklore and collective memory. Much like with the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a lot of what we think we know about Holmes is exaggerated. Just like how Bathory did not bathe in the blood of virgins to stay young, there too are some things about Holmes that are wrong. And you know what? Some of this wrong information comes from Holmes himself. He's an unreliable narrator who made things up in his memoirs that he wrote from behind bars. Now, in his book on H.H. Holmes, Adam Selzer writes that, quote, "No one did more to turn the gossip into legend than Holmes himself. The man was, beyond doubt, a pathological liar. He lied to his various wives, to his friends, to his lawyers, to his employees, to detectives, to reporters, and to everyone else, right down to the census taker. He lied in his diary. Many of the stories of him and his castle are pure fiction." End quote. Now, he's certainly a killer, and he did build a large and foreboding home, the castle, where he committed a handful of murders. That's not in question, but my goal today is to give you the real history of H.H. Holmes, the world he comes from, why people were going to Chicago, the people he murdered and why, and ultimately how his reign of terror ended. It's time to separate fact and fiction to paint a realistic picture of H.H. Holmes. What do we know about him based on evidence, not conjecture, stories, legend, and lies? And as always, to begin, we need to cover the historical context. So, let's talk about the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a period of time in U.S. history that followed the Reconstruction era, which focused on healing the U.S. after the Civil War. The Gilded Age comes right before the Progressive era. Activism, labor rights, women's suffrage, lots of good stuff in the Progressive era. Now, honestly, and I don't mean to diss or belittle any U.S. historians here, but the Gilded era just isn't the most exciting period of US history. But I'm not a US historian. I'm a big picture world historian. Not all historians enjoy the same thing. Odds are, most of the history teachers you had in high school loved US history and were probably US historians. I certainly am not. And if you were ever unlucky enough to be my student, then you know how I felt about US history. But I'll do my best to paint a proper background for Holmes's murders during this time period, because that part I do enjoy. So from roughly 1877 to 1896, the dates of the Gilded Age, the US was going through some pretty intense economic growth. Which is great, right? The Civil War ended in 1865, and the US was recovering through the Reconstruction era. Healed? God no, still super fractured. But in the North, like Chicago, and out West, there was more opportunity. And for women, too. It's well before the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but we do see more opportunities for women to get some jobs. Unfortunately, these are the stereotypical jobs for women in the early days, like secretary work, stenography, etc., but it's still better than nothing. Chicago, which was already a large-ish city by the Gilded Age, was booming. People were moving in, the economy was growing, more jobs were opening up, and a big reason for this was the World's Fair. Now, Paris, back in 1899, held their own World's Fair. Think, basically, a big ol' expo that showcases a nation's achievements. At the Paris World Fair in 1889, the Eiffel Tower was unveiled as a showcase of French monumental architecture. The US, not wanting to be outdone, decided to hold a World's Fair in honor of the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492. And I am not going to go on a Christopher Columbus didn't discover America rant here, because if I do, I will not stop. If I ever taught you world history, then you know how ranty I get when Columbus is mentioned. Anywho, there was some political lobbying over which city would get the honor of hosting, and though many might have assumed New York City, our cultural and economic capital, or maybe Washington, D.C., our political capital, Chicago won the bid. As a result, people everywhere flocked to Chicago. Architects were brought in to design buildings and gardens and fountains and all sorts of things to absolutely blow the Paris Fair out of the water. They wanted to totally overshadow the Eiffel Tower. I won't get into all that too much, but it was in the latter months of the Chicago's World Fair that the Ferris wheel debuted, which was a pretty big deal and a great feat of engineering for the time. Nowadays, we see portable Ferris wheels being carted around the country with traveling fairs, so it may not sound like a big deal to debut a Ferris wheel to rival the Eiffel Tower, but at the time, it was pretty rad, and it almost didn't happen. Lots of issues before it was perfected and displayed. And also, just side note, random tangent, is anyone else a little sketched out by traveling carnival rides? I feel like every time I see one, it's gonna be a Final Destination situation, you know what I mean? But anyway, to tie this all together, the World's Fair in Chicago brought lots of people to the city in the late 1880s and early 1890s. So many, in fact, that a lot of people went missing. Particularly young Midwestern women who had big dreams of living on their own in the big city, working a desk job, making their own money. It must have seemed like such a glamorous new life compared to what they were living before. And while Chicago was really stinky, actually, from all this work and the garbage that it produced, it was still so bustling and full of life that women flocked here en masse. They would arrive alone at train stations full of hope, of promise, probably too much innocence, and knowing human nature, we know that these women were also targets as well. Anyone could pick them up at a train station and lure them towards danger while offering promises of wealth and independence. It's a problem we still have today with trafficking. In this country too, by the way, a lot of trafficking happens in this country. Don't think it's a non-US thing. But it was in this world, Chicago in the late 1880s, early 1890s, that we get our stories of HH Holmes and his murder castle. Let's take a quick look at who Holmes is and how he ends up in Chicago. Then we can sort through the story, both fact and fiction. H.H. Holmes was born as Herman Webster Mudgett. He was exposed to the medical field at a young age. Not only did he have an uncle who was a surgeon, but the local doctor's office kept a fully articulated skeleton inside too, which is probably pretty cool for a young boy. Now, according to contemporary sources, Mudgett was really fascinated by the skeleton, which helped fuel his desire to go to medical school. Sources remark that Holmes was pretty unremarkable, actually. He didn't torture animals, he wasn't rude to girls. If anything, he was a little too obsessed with money, but nothing that would indicate the pathology of a serial killer. So, I did some digging into serial killer pathology because I'm a weirdo. Now, an old theory, very outdated now, was the McDonald triad: 3 childhood behaviors that predict violence. Those 3 indicators were 1. Cruelty and abuse to animals, 2. Arson, which is intentionally setting fire to things, and 3. Wetting the bed. Studies looked into this, and there isn't really a strong correlation between these indicators and violent criminals, particularly serial killers. Holmes certainly doesn't fit the bill here. According to his family and neighbors where he grew up in New Hampshire, Holmes was very kind to childhood pets, there's no evidence of arson, no idea about the bedwetting. More modern studies suggest a series of things that are better predictors of violence. Now, having 1 or 2 traits from this list I'm about to read out doesn't mean you'll grow up to be a serial killer, and likewise, not all killers have these traits, but it's a more well-researched list of things that can more accurately predict the presence of sociopathy, which could progress, in adulthood, to violence. Here's the list. Demonstrating no boundaries or regard for the rights of others. Having no ability to tell between right and wrong. No signs of remorse or empathy when they've done something wrong. Repeated or pathological lying. Remember this one. Manipulating or harming others, especially for personal gain. Repeatedly breaking the law with no remorse. No regard for rules around safety or personal responsibility. Narcissism, which is excessive interest or admiration in oneself. Quick to anger or overly sensitive when criticized. And displaying a superficial charm that quickly goes away when things don't go their way. So again, these are the signs of sociopathy. By no means is it a guarantee that a sociopathic child will progress into a serial killer, as there is no surefire way of predicting that. But it does seem that many adults who commit violent acts or murder had a history of childhood sociopathy. Holmes, as we'll come to learn, exhibited many of these traits. In fact, he was such a compulsive liar that, like I said before, we can't even trust his own memoir as a legitimate source of information. Now, what we do know about him is that he was born in New Hampshire, married a girl named Clara Lovering at the age of 17, worked some odd jobs while figuring his life out. He ditched Clara and New Hampshire to study medicine at the University of Michigan, and his classmates don't have positive things to say about him. He was apparently quiet and reserved, and maybe even a little creepy, according to some girls. Here are some of the things his classmates said about him, and although you have to keep in mind they were interviewed after everything went down and Holmes was arrested, so take what they say with a grain of salt. They are biased by the news that their old colleague was a killer. Now, one fellow student, John Madden, not the football guy, said the following. He seemed to take a good deal of pleasure in the uncanny things of the dissecting room. One afternoon's conversation, I remember it distinctly. He talked a great deal about what he had done in the dissecting room with, what appeared to me at the time, unnecessary gusto, and told me that the professor of anatomy was to permit him to take the body of an infant home with him for dissection during the spring vacation, which was to begin the following day. I asked where he would find a place to carry on his work without offending his neighbors, and he replied with something to the effect that he would find a place. End quote. Can we talk about spring break activities? Most people, party or play video games or sleep or whatever. Holmes brought home an infant to dissect, so that's a thing, I guess. Now, according to this source, Holmes really liked dissection and took that deceased infant home to practice, and that's pretty wild. And we know from another source that Holmes did bring his work home with him, as the lady landlord he was living with found some of his, homework in his room once and was pretty disgusted by it. Another student wrote, he was distinctly what might be termed dumb. He was slow to grasp ideas and not at all ready in reasoning. And another student, in spite of him being rather attractive, I felt a personal feeling of repugnance. One more. Even now, I can see him sitting at the lower dark end of the long table, saying but little and laughing seldom. He was of remarkably taciturn disposition, apparently very indifferent to his surroundings, coldly methodical, unresponsive to humor, and very brief in his statements. End quote. And my personal favorite, by the way, because it's just so harsh. One student remarked on Holmes having a strange odor, so they gave him the nickname of Smegma. Oh, God. So Holmes didn't make many friends at school, from the sound of it. And though he wasn't the best or brightest, or cleanest smelling, he graduated. He moved around a bit. He even stopped back home in New Hampshire to see Clara Lovering and his son, by the way, because he had a son by her, Robert, briefly before disappearing again. And it was during this post-med school pre-Chicago life that he adopted and started using his pseudonym, HH Holmes, instead of his actual name, Herman Mudgett. In 1886, Holmes was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he met and married a Myrta Belknap. Myrta, Myrta Belknap, despite still being married to Clara Lovering. He tried to file for divorce from Clara, claiming that she was adulterous, but he never pursued the case, so it was dropped. So despite it not being legal, he married Myrta, likely in early 1887, but there are no surviving records of this. We do know that they married, though, as Myrta is listed in property records as Myrta Holmes. Now, after marriage, he purchased a big plot of land in Englewood, a neighborhood of Chicago on the south side, and it was on this plot of land that he would build what would later be called his infamous murder castle. So for those of you not super familiar with the H.H. Holmes legend, I'll start off with a brief summary of the story. The one people know, the sensationalized one, the murdery, bloody, violent one that's often parroted in the media today. Most recently, it was the premise of the fourth dark picture anthology game called The Devil in Me. Those games are like point-and-click, choose-your-own-adventure cutscene quests. I like them, don't get me wrong, but they're very hit or miss with the writing. And hey, Dark Picture Anthology, give me a call if you need a good writer and need to know how to finish a story. So it was said that Holmes built a murder castle and allegedly killed as many as 200 people there. The home was near some of the World's Fair events, so he had the idea of turning his home into a hotel, where he built a series of random hallways, and traps, and chutes to the basement, and torture chambers and kill rooms. For example, he had a large, soundproof walk-in safe next to his personal office on the second floor of this 3-story building, and a gas line piped into it so he can trap people inside and gas them to death. He also had a large kiln built into the basement that could incinerate quickly without making too much smell. Bones were found within when police later searched the property, so like a personal crematorium. It was said that he would lure women in, get them to fall in love with him, promise them marriage, and get something off them. For one woman that we'll talk about later, it was her vast property holdings in Texas before killing them. It is also said that once he remodeled his building into a hotel, he would lure random guests in, mostly young women, and kill them without a trace. But, unfortunately, only some of this is really true. Sorry for those of you who like a good serial killer, but there's just no evidence to suggest that any of this is real. And though Holmes even embellished some of these things in his own account, we already know we can't trust him because he's a pathological liar and an unreliable narrator. Newspapers of the day would claim that he had hundreds of rooms laid out like a maze, with doors opening into brick walls, rooms without windows, dead-end staircases, trapdoors, and the like. And, well, he didn't. There were some secret rooms, and they were for hiding things he bought on credit but didn't pay for, so when the creditors would come looking, they wouldn't be able to find the goods that he bought. The 1890s was the age of what we call yellow journalism, a form of journalism that is based on exaggeration and sensationalism. Newspapers will present poorly researched and likely fake news using eye-catching headlines for increased sales. So, Holmes the serial killer with a murder castle who tortured and killed 200 people sells more copy than Holmes the fraudster, right? Now, Holmes did commit murders, though. I'm not going to give you the fake sensationalized murders that are associated with him, because that's not real history, that's just fiction, even if it's a much cooler story. But we will look into what this building actually was, who he killed and why, and other parts of the story that we can corroborate with evidence. Now, a lot of the legwork came from Adam Selzer, who spent a lot of time poring over evidence and sources to sort out fact from fiction. If you're interested in Holmes, you should check out his book, HH Holmes, The True Story of the White City Devil. I'll leave a link to it in the podcast description. It's a long read, I'll be honest, but it's well researched, so if you're really into this kind of stuff, check it out. Now, in 1886, Holmes bought a pharmacy at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street in Englewood. It was here that he started doing what he excelled at the most, scamming people. Holmes was a fraudster. He was really good at weaseling his way around contracts and getting out of paying for things. Now, the pharmacy was a good start for Holmes, but what he really wanted was to build his own dream home. Not one full of torture chambers and winding passageways and chutes for bodies and stuff like that, but one where he could have hidden rooms to stow away stolen goods and cover up his various crimes. By March 1887, some architects drew up plans for the first 2 floors of what would later be called Holmes's castle. In August 1887, construction began. The first floor would be 6 shops, including a pharmacy on the corner spot that Holmes would run himself. He ended up selling it off to other people, but initially he ran it. The second floor would be residential apartments, including one for Holmes, and a third story was added 5 years later. A hidden compartment was built between the first and second floors, and also a secret staircase that could be accessed from a trapdoor in the second-story bathroom. And though it would be nice to use this as proof of Holmes's 200-plus serial-killing murders, by most accounts, people knew about these quote-unquote secret features, and drugstore clerks would even sleep in the hidden compartment between shifts. What was shocking about the building wasn't the architecture, but the fact that Holmes pretty much paid for none of it. He never paid the architects who designed it, nor the iron and steel factories that provided the materials. How did he get away with it? Well, Holmes would use aliases, or sometimes just other people he knew, instead of his own name when signing a contract or bill of credit. The land, for example, wasn't paid for by an HH Holmes or a Herman Mudgett. He put it under his mother-in-law's name. So when the debtors came to collect, he would just say that since he didn't own the land, he wasn't at fault for the debts accrued, and then would direct them to the other person. Now, the building was move-in ready by the end of 1887, and Holmes, his second and not really legitimate wife Myrta, and his mother-in-law took up residence on the second floor. Myrta gave birth to their daughter and Holmes's second kid a few years later in 1889. Now, one thing that was consistent throughout Holmes's life was that he was constantly on the lookout for a get-rich-quick scheme. In Chicago, he was coming up with new plans weekly. Once, he sold pet identification cards to pet owners, promising that showing these cards to various merchants will get them a discount. He made that up, of course, but he managed to sell a bunch of them and make some money. He also enjoyed bike riding a lot, which was becoming a big craze in Chicago in the late 19th century, and he managed to swindle a lot of bike shops. He would rent a bike or two from the shop, but instead of returning it, he would just sell it off to somebody and make money off of it. And when the shop tried to collect the bike back, he would claim he didn't have it, or say he never rented it in the first place. He would also scam the people who installed things in his castle, like a safe. Now, this safe is pretty famous for some gruesome reasons, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He bought the safe on credit and had it installed in his office on the first floor. A big safe, mind you, one that you could walk into. Holmes, of course, refused to pay for the bill. So when the company came to repossess the safe, Holmes told them that they could not damage his house in order to remove it because he'd sue them. The company realized that they couldn't remove the safe without damaging his house, just opted to leave it. Now, if you know anything about the classic Holmes story, you may already have some ideas about what he did with this safe. The story goes that he used the safe to suffocate people to death. Apparently, one woman was locked in there with some acid on the ground to help hasten up the process. The woman, trying to escape, kicked the door, and because of the acid on the bottom of her feet, she left an impression of a small foot on the bottom of the door. It was only found much later on, when Holmes was in prison for a different set of murders, but this whole story is really just speculation. Some police officers thought they saw a footprint and speculated why it might have been there, but not everyone saw the footprint, so I question its validity. It's a cool story, but likely as made up as most of the other things we know about Holmes, the quote-unquote serial killer. But let's talk more about the safe, because the safe was actually real, just not the footprint acid thing. One employee later testified to the following, quote, "Holmes told me to step inside and he would close the door. I was to scream then, and he would see whether or not he could hear me. I stepped in, the door was closed, and he could just faintly hear my voice. When I came out, he said, 'I wish I could put my mother-in-law in there when she had her tantrums.'" End quote. Mother-in-law tantrums, huh? I don't blame her. Holmes put the property in her name, so she probably had to deal with all kinds of debtors and angry creditors. Now, in addition to the pharmacy and his other illegal money-making schemes, Holmes set up another business at this castle, the Warner Glass Bending Company, named after an employee, who, of course, he sacked with all of the bills. His idea was to build a furnace in the basement, which he would use to bend glass plates into a desired shape. He duped some people into thinking it worked so he can get investment money, but of course, he never really had a proper company here. Just a way to scam people out of money. He did have a bigger furnace built in the basement, the materials for which he never paid for, but it leaked gas and made the whole castle smell gross. It was after all of the scheming and swindling that he started to kill people. Holmes, in a now famous quote, said this of himself: "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since." End quote. Was he born a murderer? It's hard to know. We know that he demonstrates some of the signs of sociopathy, but based on his victims, he didn't suffer from a compulsion to kill like a lot of classic serial killers. He didn't kill to satisfy a need, but it seems he killed because someone knew too much, or got in his way, or just outlived their usefulness. So, not a serial killer. But it's hard to claim for sure, because this was over 100 years ago and we don't have all the evidence. We do know that he was married to Clara Loverling back in New Hampshire, made a half-hearted attempt at divorcing her, and just illegally married Myrta instead. Well, things get a bit spicier, because he started having affairs once Myrta gave birth to his daughter. Enter Ned and Julia Connor. Ned Connor, his wife Julia, and their daughter Pearl moved to Chicago and started working for Holmes in the jewelry department of his drugstore, September 1889. Ned and his wife Julia fought a lot, and it didn't help that Julia and Holmes had clearly taken a liking to each other. Ned and Julia got divorced, and it didn't take long before Holmes and Julia started having an affair. The daughter, Pearl, stayed with Holmes and Julia at the castle. Being a swindler, Holmes started up with his old tricks, getting some money out of his new mistress, as well as using her name on loans instead of his own, and that, of course, caused some friction between them. The last time anyone saw Julia and her daughter Pearl alive was Christmas 1891. The tenants who moved into Julia and Pearl's room noticed some weird things. Now, we need to take this source with a grain of salt as well, like the ones of Holmes's classmates, because it was written years after the event, but some of it was corroborated by other sources. A Mrs. Doyle, who lived in Julia and Pearl's flat, wrote the following, quote, "We went to live in the Holmes house, and took the flat occupied by Julia Connor. The strangest sight was in the dining room. On the floor in chairs was the clothing of Mrs. Connor and her child. A doll was lying on the floor, and Holmes quickly shoved it under the bed with his foot. It occurred to me instantly that no woman would leave for a trip, however suddenly, without taking at least some of her toilet articles, which were on the dresser, for they were indispensable to her. We found the bureau drawers filled with Mrs. Connor's clothing of every kind, and it was all neatly and smoothly put away." End quote. That's strange, no? She disappeared around Christmas, never to be heard from again, and left her clothing and personal items behind? And her small daughter, Pearl, left her doll behind? Very suspicious. Now, Holmes was telling people that she had to flee because she got word her sister was dying, right? So she went back home. But of course, nobody from Julia's family heard from her. Once arrested, Holmes did tell his lawyer that he killed Julia and her daughter. We don't know why exactly, and we don't know how, but the evidence in Holmes's testimony give us a pretty good idea that he did kill his mistress and get rid of their bodies in the basement. They were one of a handful who were killed at the murder castle. See, the problem here is, once again, Holmes. He's a compulsive liar, and Julia's final fate shows us that. Sometimes he would say he didn't kill her. Other times, he would say he killed her during an abortion procedure after Holmes had gotten her pregnant. He once claimed that he didn't mean to kill her, but she died during the operation. It's impossible to know for sure, but what we do know is that she is likely Holmes's first victim. Again, that we know about. It's all just best guesses here. But you know what? Even if Julia did accidentally die during a risky abortion procedure, that doesn't explain Pearl, the daughter. If he never meant to kill Julia, what could explain Pearl's disappearance, right? I mean, if Julia died, couldn't Holmes have just given Pearl back to her father, Ned, or Julia's family? This goes back to my earlier point. He killed when people got in his way. Julia was no longer useful, and her daughter were in the way, so Holmes likely just dispensed with them both. When police later dug up in the basement of the murder castle, they found the bones of a girl estimated between the ages 6 and 10, and that was our girl Pearl. Now, Holmes got himself another mistress, Emmeline Cigrand, around May or June 1892. You want to know how this one goes? If you guessed about the same as Julia, you'd be right. Now, according to other sources, the people Emmeline knew in Chicago, the poor girl was infatuated with Holmes. She would move around from place to place, which was apparently Holmes's doing, and did not stay in the castle. Perhaps he learned his lesson by keeping his first mistress under the same roof, but that means that a lot of people knew Emmeline because they housed her, and according to those various sources, poor Emmeline would not stop talking about Holmes. It's interesting that this is the same man who in medical school was a loner, right? Creeped out his classmates and apparently smelled cheesy and gross. I guess he learned how to get people to do what he wanted by charming the pants off them. Literally, in some cases. Or maybe his classmates were just lying because they jumped on the Holmes was a weirdo all along train after he was arrested. Who knows, right? But at some point, Emmeline was bragging about being engaged. Now, she didn't mention Holmes specifically, but evidence would suggest that it was him. Curiously enough, Ned Connor actually ran into Emmeline once he came back to do some business with Holmes, and this was after his wife and daughter, Julia and Pearl, went missing. He noted that Emmeline hovered around Holmes too much and essentially told her to keep her distance, that Holmes takes advantage of women. I mean, he's not wrong, right? He basically watched Holmes take his wife from under him. In December of 1892, almost a year after Julia and Pearl were killed, Emmeline Cigrand disappeared too. She had told an older couple who lived in Holmes's castle that she was going home to see her family for Christmas, but in reality, she was just gone. When the neighbor asked Holmes if Emmeline had returned from the trip, or if she'd been in touch, his response was a cold and callous, "Oh, she's gone away to get married." I don't think the neighbor believed the story, because she and Emmeline were close. Surely Emmeline would have mentioned a wedding, right, and a boyfriend? The next day, that neighbor saw some of Holmes's henchmen remove a large, heavy trunk, big enough to fit a corpse, and put it in a wagon. Conman Holmes went to great lengths to convince people she had married some other guy, though. He printed out marriage announcements, he sent Emmeline's things home to her parents with a typed letter claiming it was her, saying that she no longer needed them, and so on. He even had things printed in the local newspaper in her parents' hometown. We know it's all nonsense because her supposed new husband, Robert Phelps, didn't exist. Now, it was around the time of Emmeline's murder that Holmes was building the third floor of his castle. As usual, Holmes was conning investors and builders out of their supply, labor, and time. He used aliases, friends, and the women he charmed as the names for things, so when creditors came looking, he could escape capture. If he signed something as H.S. Campbell, but never paid the bill, then when creditors came looking, he could send them on a wild goose chase, looking for someone who didn't exist. Oh, and by the way, if you're getting some weird ideas here, just know that Holmes was caught for all of this fraud, and you would be too. The government does not play around with this kind of stuff, and they are very good at finding fraudsters at all levels. Really big things, little small things. So just don't do it. Now, at the same time Holmes was expanding his castle and doing his normal money-making schemes, he was probably planning for the World's Fair, which was about to begin in Chicago. Englewood was close to some parts of the fair, so for a man like Holmes, this was a golden opportunity to make some money. Adam Selzer in his book on Holmes does a good job framing how Holmes sought to make money on this. Quote, "Although Holmes said that the new third floor would be a hotel, he seems to have had no intention of actually using it as one. The amount of money he could make renting out rooms was small potatoes to what he could make by convincing others he was opening a hotel. With such a venture in the works, he could raise money from investors who would never see a penny back. He could buy up innumerable goods on credit to sell without paying the bills, and then make thousands in insurance money by setting fire to it." End quote. Even though he fancied himself a criminal mastermind, at least where fraud was concerned, he was getting sloppy. People who lived and worked in the building knew he was doing this, and a few of them ratted him out when the creditors came looking for their stuff that Holmes had bought and never paid for. And after searching around, the creditors found a bunch of hidden rooms on the third floor where they recovered their stuff. Holmes had apparently wallpapered over doors to hide his, essentially, stolen goods. It made the Chicago Tribune newspaper in a headline called, "Hid in Secret Rooms." Now, this all happened before the fair started, so it's more evidence to suggest that Holmes wasn't planning to use his building as a hotel. He just wanted people to think he was, so that he can con them out of things he would then sell to make a profit. It was also at this time that Holmes had found another mistress, Minnie Williams, a young woman from Texas who was building a career as an actress before deciding to settle down in the more stable job of being a stenographer in Chicago. And unfortunately, she met and fell for H.H. Holmes. She also happened to own around $10,000 worth of property back in Fort Worth. Now, Minnie is an interesting person in the Holmes story, but I don't really have time to go over the entirety of it. Again, read either Selzer's book or the popular Devil in the White City by Erik Larson for more information on Minnie. But in terms of this story, Minnie was used very much in the same way as Emmeline before her and Julia before that. Minnie was listed as the owner on several properties, deeds, and loans, so Holmes wouldn't have to pay up when creditors came looking. Holmes also wooed and pursued her, but to Minnie Williams, he used the alias Dr. Harry Gordon. Now, Minnie had a sister, Nanny, who was suspicious of the new beau. So Nanny came to Chicago to check up on Minnie and her new fiancé, Dr. Harry Gordon, who of course is just Holmes. When Nanny arrived, they told her that they were already married. And there is no evidence to suggest they actually were married. If they had a ceremony, it was likely a sham and was certainly never registered with the city. There are no records to prove that they were officially together. But regardless, they told Nanny they were married. And Holmes had also been swindling Minnie out of her Texas land. Long story short and simplified here, Holmes killed Nanny Williams sometime around July 4th, 1893. Minnie Williams disappeared the next day on July 5th. A little over a month later, on August 13th, a fire broke out on the new-ish third floor of Holmes's castle. Good thing he took out some insurance on it, huh? Nothing suspicious there. Only a handful of regular occupants were in the building at the time, no guests, which gives more credence to the idea that it was not really a hotel housing people for the World's Fair. Oh, and nobody died in the fire. It's likely that Holmes set the fire because there were some things he wanted to cover up, namely the bodies and evidence of the killings of Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Cigrand, and Minnie and Nanny Williams. And of course the insurance fraud. Now, unfortunately for Holmes, he was in way over his head with all of these schemes, the fire one, but also all of the other schemes and tricks he had done over the years. He had spent a considerable amount of time redirecting and fending off the creditors, but they were getting closer to proving that Holmes was a con man. It was the fire that really sealed the deal here. They were pretty sure this fire was an insurance scam, right? We know that Holmes left town shortly afterwards, probably because he knew he'd be caught if he stayed. Now, Selzer notes that though Holmes was definitely a con artist, he wasn't really a successful one, because there are at least 60 documented lawsuits filed against Holmes or his many aliases, and in reality that number could be much higher. Now, there was one last mistress, a Miss Georgiana Yoke, who he married in 1894. Georgiana knew that Holmes went around using aliases, which is interesting. His wife, his second wife, Myrta, certainly didn't know. Or at least Holmes didn't tell her. I mean, who knows how much Myrta suspected. She only lived in the castle in the very beginning, but was jealous of how well Holmes was able to woo these girls, so Holmes moved her and their daughter across the city, and he abandoned her when he left Chicago for good. Now, Miss Yoke followed Holmes around during his last years before he was caught and arrested, and she was the one mistress who wasn't killed by Holmes. It's not clear if he ever intended to kill her or what, but she was there with him until his arrest. Now, we need to introduce another character here to our story. Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was one of Holmes's accomplices from Chicago. It's possible that he was the reason Holmes met Emmeline Cigrand, and he also ran one of Holmes's money-making shell companies. Holmes and Pitezel ended up meeting in Fort Worth, Texas, where Holmes inherited lands that he got from Minnie Williams, his third mistress. It was apparently going to be another castle, like the one in Chicago. According to local papers, the description seems to match the one in Chicago very closely. But unlike with Chicago, Holmes kind of abandoned it after it was built. It's not clear what he wanted to do with the building, as no shops were set up on the first floor, and he didn't move into it. Most likely, as he did with the third-floor hotel of his Chicago castle, the Texas one was likely just to swindle a bunch of people out of their money and goods. Both Holmes and Pitezel swindled a lot of money out of people and left Texas. But some of those creditors were chasing him down, just like the Chicago ones. The heat was on. Now, the pair did a bunch more scamming around the country, and for a short sting, Holmes was even arrested in St. Louis for fraud. But they ended up getting out and going to Philadelphia. Georgiana Yoke joined Holmes there, as did Benjamin Pitezel a little while after. Holmes and Pitezel were planning some life insurance schemes, something Holmes had been doing for much of his adult life at this point. However, this time was different. On September 4th, Benjamin Pitezel's corpse was discovered rotting away in a room he rented on Callowhill Street. We're not really sure why Holmes did it. They had planned to find a decoy body, say it was Pitezel, cash out on the life insurance check, and then move on. But instead, Holmes murdered Pitezel. Did he back out at the last second and Holmes decided to kill him for real? Was he a threat, so Holmes killed him to remove him? Did Holmes want to kill him for knowing too much about Holmes's past crimes? Again, we don't really know. Now, Holmes in his memoir said that from the moment he met Pitezel, he knew he was going to kill him, but, Holmes is a liar. All we know is that Pitezel was dead, and it was Holmes who did it, because he left enough evidence this time to prove it. Holmes used chloroform to knock Pitezel out. It's not like in the films where you hold up a rag for a few seconds and they pass out. It requires a lot more time, and you would imagine that the victim would be struggling and kicking, right? So it would be really difficult. But Pitezel was an alcoholic, so it's likely that he was pretty drunk when Holmes drugged him, and that would make him easier to knock out. Holmes used chloroform on Pitezel until his supply of oxygen was cut out and he died. For good measure, Holmes poured some chloroform down Pitezel's throat. Now, Holmes tried to make the scene look like an accident and hoped that his body would start to decompose before anyone found it, further destroying any evidence, but someone stumbled on that body 2 days after it happened. Coroners were able to tell that the man had died from chloroform poisoning, which told investigators that he was murdered, and the scene was staged to make it look like an accident. Meanwhile, Holmes was traveling to see Pitezel's widow, Carrie, and the couple's 5 kids. When he arrived, he was upset to learn that Carrie already knew her husband was dead, and therefore his plan to stage Pitezel's corpse and have it found weeks later was ruined. But he managed to convince the widow Carrie that he needed to bring the oldest daughter, 15-year-old Alice, and 2 other children back to Philadelphia to identify the body. Carrie, distraught and unable to leave herself because of a very young baby at home, agreed to let Holmes take 3 of her kids away. Do you know where this is going? You should be able to guess where this is going. By the end of September, Holmes was in charge of 15-year-old Alice, 12-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard. He traveled from city to city with the kids, checking into different hotels with them and Georgiana, using different aliases along the way. But he would put the kids in a separate hotel from Georgiana and himself, so it was likely she didn't actually know the kids were being carted around the country. And I'm skipping over a lot of this story, by the way, to get to the ending. It's a really long and complex one, so if this is all fascinating to you, go read Selzer's book. Now, not only was he moving the 3 Pitezel children and Georgiana around separately, but he was also moving around Mrs. Pitezel and her 2 remaining children. That's a lot to juggle. There were apparently a couple times where he almost messed up, and the 3 kids almost saw their mom in the same city. Why was he even doing this? And since we know that Holmes kills off people who know too much or get in his way, Holmes at some point made the decision to kill off the 3 Pitezel kids he took charge of: Alice, Nellie, and Howard. 8-year-old Howard was first. Holmes killed him in Indianapolis on October 10th. Now, they didn't find the bodies of the children until Holmes was already in jail for fraud, but when investigators were following Holmes' movements around trying to find these kids, they discovered human remains. Holmes had killed the boy, dismembered him, and attempted to burn his body in the chimney. But it got stuck, and the act of all of the body parts being squished together meant that they didn't all burn up. Holmes also forgot to clean out the bones from the chimney flue, probably because he was rushing around by this point. He saw the writing on the wall and knew, with all the investigators from Chicago, Texas, and Philly looking for him to charge him with fraud, that he was going to be caught soon. He needed to tie up some loose ends, the children, to be able to get away. The girls were killed together, later, in Toronto on October 25th. When investigators traced Holmes there, they found a man who remembers Holmes and the 2 girls renting a property next door. Holmes had apparently asked the guy to borrow a shovel. Holmes returned it the next day and then left the property. So when investigators dug around, literally, they found the girls buried haphazardly in the basement. Alice was on her side and Nellie was face down. Both were nude and partially decomposed by the time investigators found them. There's a lot of speculation on how Holmes did it, including a story about putting them in a large trunk and gassing them, but again, it's just speculation. He probably just poisoned them. Unlike with little 8-year-old Howard, the girls were not dismembered. The scene Holmes left was sloppy, kind of like how he was a bit sloppy with their father, Benjamin Pitezel, and the accidental death scene. The girls were not buried too deeply, and he didn't fix the top layer, so it was clear where he had dug a hole and disturbed the ground. Holmes had even tried to burn some of the girls' clothing, but he packed it too tightly in the chimney so large scraps survived. Some of their toys were also left behind, which helped with the identification. Unfortunately for Holmes, fortunately for the rest of us, detectives were closing in on him now. With every city Holmes fled to, with Georgiana and the Pitezel children, before he killed them, the detectives were figuring out his M.O., his modus operandi. On November 17th, Holmes was caught by 3 detectives in Boston. He was brought back to Philly to stand charges for defrauding Fidelity Mutual by faking the death of Benjamin Pitezel, though in reality Pitezel was dead and it was Holmes who killed him. But by this point, the children's bodies had not been found, so Holmes was only in jail for insurance fraud. The bodies would be discovered much later. In the meantime, the press started putting out tons of stories of this master fraudster, and Holmes loved it. All the press convinced Chicago police to start checking out his castle, as there were always rumors about strange happenings there. And when police got to the basement, they found the following: barrels of acid with ribs and a skull at the bottom, mounds of quicklime, a kiln, a dissection table stained with blood, surgical tools, charred high-heel shoes, 18 ribs from a child's torso, several vertebrae, a bone from a foot, a shoulder blade, a hip socket, clothes in the walls and in ash pits, including a girl's blood-stained overalls and dress, and human hair clogging a pipe. Once investigators, particularly one named Frank Geyer, found the bodies of the Pitezel children, there was indisputable evidence that Holmes was a murderer. Reportedly, Holmes' response was, "Well, I guess they'll hang me for this." And he was right. On May 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged to death at the Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia. According to reports, it was not a clean hanging. His neck did not snap in the initial fall, which would have killed him instantly and is typically what you expect with a hanging. Instead, he convulsed for a while, the body spun around, his legs were shaking. Apparently it was so gruesome that 2 spectators fainted. And after a few minutes, Holmes died from asphyxiation. His lawyers carried out his request for his final remains, that they be encased in cement so that he could not be dissected and experimented on the way that he did to other people. Now we know for sure that Holmes was responsible for killing 9 people: Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie and Nanny Williams, Benjamin Pitezel, and Pitezel's children Alice, Nellie, and Howard. The rest is just speculation. Did he kill upwards of 200 people in his murder hotel? Probably not. There's no real evidence it was a hotel. It was just built that way so he could scam people. He did commit a handful of murders there, the first 5 women, which is bad, but nothing like what the stories make it seem. Holmes himself claimed to have killed 26 or 27 people, but several of them were later found alive, so, again, unreliable narrator who just liked the attention. Now, did lots of people go missing in Chicago in the 1890s? Yes, they did. Particularly those vulnerable young women on the promise of a brand new exciting life. But we need to make sure we don't pin all of the bad things that happened in Chicago on Holmes. He probably would have liked that attention, but just because someone went missing doesn't mean that he did it. He may be the most famous murderer and fraudster out of the 1890s Chicago, but he wasn't responsible for every disappearance. The story with all the blood and the gore is much more compelling than insurance fraud, I'll admit, but it's just not the truth. With history, we need to make sure we're basing our assertions on fact, not fiction. Thanks for joining me in this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the real story of the HH Holmes murder castle. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. Be sure to follow my podcast wherever you listen so you know when new episodes are dropped. It really helps my channel grow as well if you could subscribe and follow my podcast on all the different services. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.